Question number 4, James Shaw.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Minister of Finance and reads, does he have confidence that the New Zealand Superannuation Fund is living up to its commitments to ethical investment as outlined in its responsible investment framework?
The Honourable Stephen Joyce.
Mr. Speaker, on behalf of the Minister of Finance, the answer is yes. It is important to note that the New Zealand Superannuation Fund operates independently of the government and is overseen by an independent board. But it does have a responsible investment framework which is closely aligned with the United Nations Principles for Responsible Investment. It is benchmarked and assessed by the UN on a regular basis. The last report concluded that the Super Fund was managing responsible investment issues and risks to a best practice standard and were one of the best performing signatories of the principles globally.
Supplementary, Mr. Speaker.
Supplementary question, James Shaw.
So does he believe that loaning $200 million through a tax shelter country like Luxembourg, using a shell company like Oak Finance, which was created by a US investment bank like Goldman Sachs, to a Portuguese bank like Espírito Santo, which collapsed amid accusations of fraud and tax evasion, to help a Chinese company now under investigation for bribery, working for the Venezuelan state oil company, is a good example of the Super Fund living up to its responsible investment framework commitments?
Mr. Winston.
Honourable Stephen Joyce.
Well, Mr. Speaker, on behalf of the Minister of Finance, I think there's distinctions between the framework generally and particular investments, and I think the member raises fair questions about that investment. And I know those questions were addressed at the Select Committee this morning. I think it is important that the Super Fund be very careful to operate carefully as well as investing responsibly. I think the House has noted, and I've seen public reports, that most people in the House think on the whole they've performed well, but I think we would all hope and consider that they should learn any lessons that need to be learnt from this particular investment.
Supplementary?
Supplementary question, James Shaw.
When he told the House on February the 18th that he, quote, expects the Super Fund to take into account the risks to future profits for the companies in which it invests, end quote, is he concerned that the Super Fund is investing hundreds of millions of dollars in financial products like the Oak Finance Goldman Sachs loan that Moody's described as speculative and high risk?
Honourable Stephen Joyce.
Well, Mr. Speaker, on behalf of the Minister of Finance, I think I said in the previous answer that there were issues of concern there and that I believe that the Super Fund should be very careful to learn the lessons from that. I mean, this is an interesting situation where the Super Fund, I think, rightly operates independently of politicians, but as a result of that, it has a heightened level of responsibility in terms of the way it makes investments. Again, I think on the whole, the Parliament would probably be supportive of the returns that the fund has been making. That obviously comes with some risk, all investment does, and we would expect that the Super Fund would learn any lessons that should be learnt from this particular investment outcome.
Supplementary, Mr. Speaker.
Supplementary question, James Shaw.
Does he also believe that investing in fossil fuel companies that are directly contributing to the disappearance of small island states and the displacement of millions of people from catastrophic climate change is a good example of the Super Fund living up to its responsible investment framework commitments?
Honourable Stephen Joyce.
Mr. Speaker, on behalf of the Minister of Finance, I do actually think that it is okay for the Super Fund to invest in fossil fuel companies in the same way that I think it is okay that the Green Party continues to fly around the country in planes fuelled with fossil fuel. The simple fact of the matter is fossil fuels are a part of our daily life and actually a part of the investment scene internationally. And I think we have to be very careful about the suggestion that we should start telling the Super Fund not to invest in a whole range of things because of the political views of certain parties in Parliament.
Supplementary, Mr. Speaker.
Supplementary question, David Seymour.
What seems to be coming out of the answers is that there are several...
Order. Can we just have the question, please?
What would happen if the Super Fund was to have another objective added, which was to be a supplier of capital to small businesses at sub-market rates?
Honourable Stephen Joyce.
Well, Mr. Speaker, on behalf of the Minister of Finance, I think the member illustrates some of the risks when various politicians decide what a fund such as the super fund should or shouldn't invest in according to their political beliefs rather than to the likely investment returns of the fund. And actually, it is good that the fund invests in small and medium-sized businesses provided the return is good. The purpose of this fund is to help meet New Zealand's future superannuation entitlements. And we do have to be careful not to be taking political views on all the different types of investment that we think the fund should or shouldn't invest in and take the risk that it actually ends up losing money because the Parliament gives it such confused objectives.
Supplementary, Mr Speaker.
Supplementary question, James Shaw.
So given that answer, Mr Speaker, when he told the House on February the 18th that it is ethical to invest in oil and coal companies because there is a profit to be made, does he also think that the super fund should invest in tobacco companies and arms manufacturers because there's profits to be made there too?
Honourable Stephen Joyce.
Mr Speaker, on behalf of the Minister, what I believe is that the super fund should operate their responsible investment framework, which they do, and that they should come up with that framework themselves. We have an independent benchmarking of that framework from the United Nations Principles for Responsible Investment. That is benchmarked on a regular basis, and the conclusion by that body is that the New Zealand Superannuation Fund is managing responsible investment issues and risks to a best practice standard. And I think on that basis we can assume it is balancing those investment opportunities, all the investment opportunities, appropriately for the fund.
Supplementary, Mr Speaker.
Supplementary question, James Shaw.
Why is he so reluctant to use his power to direct the guardians of the fund to stop putting New Zealanders' hard-won superannuation savings into polluting industries, stranded fossil fuel assets and dodgy deals?
Honourable Stephen Joyce.
Well, Mr Speaker, on behalf of the Minister of Finance, again, I think the member is fixing on two issues, one of which I think there's a legitimate concern about the outcome of an investment, and the other which frankly is a little hypocritical coming from the Green Party that uses fossil fuels. And Mr Speaker, the challenge with that is we actually have a fund which I think again by all agreement is actually performing reasonably well because we don't fetter it on a regular basis with politicians' decisions. So I think the Parliament and the Minister would have to be very, very careful before making those sorts of directions, and generally that has been the case on all sides of this House.
Question number 5, Kanwal Singh Bakshi.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and my question is to the Minister.